is the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen. I'm Ashton Cohen. I'm joined today by John Sitilides. John is a geopolitical strategist and diplomacy consultant for the U.S. Department of State. He has been featured and published a bunch of different places: Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Fox News, Bloomberg. He advises major corporations and institutional clients about global risks and security concerns. Basically the kind of things that we are seeing very well today, especially talk about Ukraine in particular. So, John, thanks so much for being with me. It's a real pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me, Ashton. It's great to be with you and your audience today.
Absolutely. So let's start off there. I recently came onto your work. One of the other people in the geopolitical sort of strategy space I followed previously has been Peter Zehine. Peter famously now, in his 2014 book, he talked about how by 2022 he anticipated Russia making a move on Ukraine because it would be their last chance to do it, under the premise that this is sure their last real opportunity to make a move like this because their demographic declines and they wanted to expand their borders. And his theory was they're going to go into Ukraine and then the Baltic states would be next, and that's how they're going to sort of secure their not necessarily expand their borders, right? Expand their borders, which is something that certainly Soviet Union did, something that Russia traditionally has liked to do throughout history, and something even Putin himself has spoken about on many occasions prior. From your standpoint, this Russian invasion of Ukraine, is this something that you and other people who have a sort of expertise in this space, who follow this space closely, is this something that you particular and others around you that anticipated? Or was this a surprise?
Let's go a little bit further back in history, Ashton. You bring up some very interesting observations here. In the mid-1990s, the political scientist Samuel Huntington wrote his seminal book called The Clash of Civilizations. And he wrote about countries that he considered divided, that really were not unified countries. And one of the countries that he mentioned, I believe the book was published in 1995 or 1996, was Ukraine. Essentially because it was Catholic on one side and Orthodox on the other. It was part of the Soviet Union but had EU and NATO aspirations, and that really the tug of history was going to make this very difficult as a unified country going forward. Fast forward to around 2015, where John Mearsheimer, the renowned political scientist today, basically warned the West that the strategy of continuing to encroach on Russia's borders via the Baltics, via Poland, via Romania, and then eventually through Ukraine, was going to be highly problematic from Moscow's perspective, whoever the leader of that country was going to be, but especially as long as it was Vladimir Putin. And so we've had some very astute scholars who for decades have been warning the West about the strategy. And this is not necessarily to blame the West for the invasion of Ukraine, because most experts from the military perspective and also geopolitical did not anticipate a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What we had been looking at instead was a series of rolling military operations, largely to secure Russia's acquisition or annexation, I'll say, of Crimea in 2014, its backing of the pro-Russian separatist movement in the Donbass region in southeastern Ukraine. And we see them consolidating those gains right now. And I think what we see in addition to these particular rolling operations right now is a Russian effort to close off the Sea of Azov and the southeast to Ukrainian ports, connect that geographically with the Crimea Peninsula in the south central part of Ukraine, and connect it geographically to the critical strategic port of Odessa in the western part of Ukraine's Black Sea coast, and essentially seal off Ukraine from the Black Sea, have Ukraine's exports and imports, sea-based that is, controlled by Russia, and allow Russia essentially to control the Ukrainian economy. It doesn't have to take over Kiev at that point. It can simply compel the Ukrainian government to bid Russia's will, or it'll starve the country economically.
Mm-hmm. I see. So those are the goals that they've had for quite some time. And are there other territorial ambitions you think that have been a part of this operation to want to invade Ukraine, such as going after the Baltics?
Well, I never like to pretend I can read anyone's mind. So I
Mhm.
don't know what's in Vladimir Putin's mind before or what's in his mind right now, and of course, what's to come. It seems as though, in retrospect, right now that we're Monday morning quarterbacking on the beginning of the invasion, that there was a sense that they could move in towards Kiev right away without even laying siege to it, but essentially force the government to surrender. They probably had bad intelligence that the Ukrainian people would not resist in any meaningful way, neither would the Ukrainian military, and they would be able to gain far greater political concessions at the get-go, and that all
Right.
failed. And so it looks like right now we're in Plan B, where they're digging in around Kiev. They're not going to be withdrawing forces yet, but almost all the military muscle is being directed at the Donbass region, and then I think again to the Black Sea. So it looks like they're probably going to be refreshing troops, bringing in heavier armor and artillery, and hopefully not, but potentially laying siege to other countries as they've done, I mean, to other cities as they've done with Mariupol over the last several weeks, turning it in effect into a new Grozny or a new Aleppo. As for
Mhm.
beyond Ukraine, Ashton, it's way too early to tell right now. I think because Putin's initial military objectives were dashed by the Ukrainian resistance,
Right.
and it seems to me that with the US beefing up its presence in Poland, it makes Poland essentially a Russian attack on NATO, and that's going
Hmm.
to escalate very quickly, out of control, not only in ways that are undesirable for the United States and for the West, but for Putin and for Russia. So we
Right.
also have a fear card to play on him. We don't need to be mindful only of what can be done to, pro-Western forces. My larger concern down the road is going to be in the Baltic countries because they are smaller. It is easier for
Hmm.
Russia to move in, literally take over one, two, or three of those countries in probably 2 to 3 days.
Right.
And they're also geographically cut off from most of the NATO presence in Europe, including with a small piece of sovereign Russian territory called Kaliningrad, which
Hmm.
is sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland. And the
Right.
Suwalki Gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus is an area that is easy for military exploitation by Russia if they're looking to physically cut off the Baltic countries from a land perspective from Poland and other land forces in NATO, and also from the sea, with the Baltic Sea largely dominated by Finland and Sweden, two countries that
Hmm.
are not yet in NATO.
Yeah, yeah. That, I mean, several good points there. So with the Kaliningrad, I always wondered why Russian help was so sort of adamant about holding on to that. Now you can kind of see the strategic importance of that. It's like kind of like right next to Poland. It's detached from the rest of Russia.
Yeah.
It's interesting, one of those interesting little places in the world.
And
Um,
it's extremely
yeah.
heavily armed. And Russia has every right
Hmm.
to arm its own territory,
Right.
again, in a very strategic area next to Poland, not too distant from Germany. And they also have their S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems based there, and also cruise missiles with several hundred-mile ranges. So Kaliningrad is
Hmm.
essentially a Russian land extension near the heart of NATO, and we never talk about it. Instead, we're
Right.
busy here talking about Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very good point. So there's that aspect, and then there's the aspect about essentially that you mentioned with regards to NATO expansion and what role that played, because that's always sort of like a debate. And I mean, it's difficult to know would this have happened had NATO not continually expanded and been a part of essentially other regimes surrounding Russia, and if that pushed them into a corner, or if he would have done this anyways. I mean, these are impossible questions to know.
But may I
Yeah,
interject,
please.
Ashton?
Yes.
I tend to take world leaders at their word. Most of them
Hmm.
tend to very easily and candidly broadcast their objectives to the outside world. And when we talk later on about China and Iran, we'll talk about this same habit of world leaders. We tend to not believe what they say and dismiss it as meant for domestic consumption, but I take their statements
Right.
very seriously. So I also date this back to Vladimir Putin's very famous speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, where he essentially declared his rejection, his opposition to the US led rules based international order.
Hmm.
From his perspective, and we don't know that it's honest, but from his perspective, he had reached out to Europe, to the United States, shortly after he came to power in 2000, in 99, 2000. He reminds the West that he reached out to then President George Bush right after the September 11th attacks and made very
Hmm.
clear that Russia wanted to be helpful to the United
Right.
States in dealing with
First
Al
world leader.
Qaeda in Afghanistan. Although, of course, that's a mutual interest because Russia has its own concern about Islamist radical terrorists coming out of
Mhm.
Central Asia into its underbelly, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and the like. But he declared an end to the system as we all knew it and made very clear that he intended to draw red lines. He did not do so with Poland and the Baltics and Romania, but he made very clear that Ukraine was a non starter. That was a completely
Hmm.
unacceptable encroachment by NATO. And even if Ukraine wasn't going to be joining NATO anytime soon, still a highly corrupt country, not meeting any of NATO's democratic norms by any stretch of the imagination, and also needing a number of economic liberalization reforms as well. The idea that there might be NATO missiles stationed in Europe, more and more joint exercises as recently as November of 2021, I think really was what broke the camel's back on Moscow's side, or
Mhm.
specifically on Putin's side. So he had made very clear that he was going to push back. Again, I think most of us are stunned by the swiftness, the scope,
Mhm.
and the massive armor that had been massed around Ukraine for the last 10 months, right? They've been building up these forces essentially since March of 2021. This is not a surprise, except, again, the scope of the invasion, not the fact that Russian forces would be moving into Ukraine.
Yeah, take leaders at the word. I like that because traditionally throughout history, that's kind of been the most rational move to make was to listen to what people actually say and take them at their word. Because even the most vile, disgusting dictators have essentially been fairly transparent about what they hope to achieve. Whether we're looking at the World War II ones like
Right.
Hitler in particular, Mussolini. I remember even
Hmm.
someone like Stalin was very much adamant about expanding the communist order around the world, and people kind of dismissed that as well. They dismissed Hitler, and yeah, traditionally speaking, the even the most vile people have been congruent in terms of what they say and what they hope to act, and it's been oftentimes the West's naivete or their maybe even hubris to a certain extent, disregarding some of the stuff that seemed outlandish or crazy, and then these people actually act on it, right? That seems to be one of the main mistakes that we made over and over again throughout, particularly I think the 20th century.
One might say, Ashton, that we in the West consider ourselves hyper rational, very objective about these matters,
Hmm.
and the rest of the world thinks the way that we do. And that's a great failing on the part of Western strategists to be so dismissive of other political cultures and the statements and intentions of world leaders who really don't share our objectives and our interests. We learned that with Vladimir Putin. We're learning it with General Secretary Xi Jinping of the Chinese Communist
Hmm.
Party.
Hmm.
I'm afraid we're not learning it with the mullahs in Iran now that we have the
Right.
Biden administration seemingly obsessed with an Iran nuclear deal, and we'll get to that in short order, I presume. But when they talk about their intentions, whether it was Ukraine, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Israel and the Middle East more broadly, I take their statements with deadly seriousness.
Hmm. Yeah, and another excellent point. I think you're in DC, so you certainly recognize this, and I'm here in Los Angeles, and a lot of the professional class, the what we call the elite class, are individuals who grew up with a certain mindset, who have very, for example, I think the mullahs would be one of the best examples of this. There are people in the United States, particularly in the major coastal cities and in DC, who couldn't even conceive of the fact that a religious ideology motivates people because it plays such a non-existent role in their lives that to think that there's a religious ideology that can motivate your politics beyond just the material is something so abstract to them. So they make decisions based on them thinking about it, right? It's almost like this sort of Western, paternalism to a certain extent. Um, and you see this also with China, as you mentioned, people not understanding the role of culture in the East, the role of duty in the East,
Hmm.
the ancient traditions. They think of things. They look at the world. They project onto the world their values, their experience with growing up as a Western elite in America, and think other major people, other major leaders in the world think the same way they do, but they don't, right? So if you can, let's discuss China and their role with Russia and what China's role is with respect to this current conflict, and if there's any lessons you think that they're taking out of this, because one of the things people prognosticate about is will China go after Taiwan next?
Yeah, well, let's delve there because it was just about 2 years ago that General Secretary Xi gave a speech. It was in January of 2019, I believe, and it was directed essentially at the Taiwanese government and the Taiwanese people, as well as to the United States and any of the countries that might come to Taiwan's aid in the event of an invasion. And Chairman Xi stated that Taiwan is going to be absorbed into China by 2049. That's the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's rise to power from 1949 in the aftermath of World War II. And ideally, Taiwan will voluntarily join with China, but China will not forswear the use of military force to compel Taiwan to be unified with China. So the Chinese government is clear. Sometime in the next 2.5 decades, Taiwan will be incorporated into China. The question then, Ashton, is how and along what timeline? So I think what's happening in Ukraine right now is affecting those two decisions. One, in terms of timeline, I think what's pretty clear is I presume that Chairman Xi was as stunned as President Putin was by the swiftness of the US and Western sanctions regime that's been
Hmm.
imposed on Russia. What we're teaching the world is that you don't need to have a naval blockade to destroy an economy. You can do it using financial instruments, and the United States wielding the power of the US dollar as the global currency. So China is not as exposed as Russia is. China is a much larger economy, much more integrated in global supply chains and trade with Europe and the United States and other Asian countries. But I would sense that she has given the orders to top party cadres to run through the entire list of potential US and European sanctions that could potentially be imposed on China in a worst case scenario if, let's say, after the November Chinese Communist Party National Congress, where Xi hopes to gain his third consecutive term in power and sort of shatter the precedent of recent Chinese premiers and um, presidents who've had two terms and go back to the Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping model of dictatorship for life. So I don't see
Hmm.
anything serious happening in and around Taiwan until after November. But the end of the year, early 2023, if there were to be military operations, and again, they don't have to be massive on the scale of Ukraine, um, just the way I had imagined that there would be sort of smaller, more targeted military operations. You could see, for instance, Ashton, the Chinese Navy taking over several tiny Taiwanese islands immediately off the coast of China or deep in the South China Sea and leaving Taiwan, the island, alone. But then what does Taiwan do to regain its islands? And will it
Right.
actually take on the second most powerful military in the world to gain back tiny islands with several hundred inhabitants? And is the US really going to risk a possible nuclear war with China over tiny Taiwanese islands 5 miles off the coast of mainland China? So you could see a salami slice series of operations by the Chinese Communist Party against Taiwan starting in 2023, and the Chinese government looking to prepare itself against global financial and trade sanctions. Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
Also, you could have the Chinese government decide there's really no rush right now for any type of military operations, period, because the Chinese economy is still too dependent on Western financing, Western technology. If they
Right.
were to be cut off, the Chinese government economy could probably absorb it more effectively than the Russian economy, but it would still constitute a major setback. And the compact between the
Hmm.
Chinese Communist Party and 1.3 billion Chinese people is give us continued material progress and security, and we'll let you rule the country. But if there's a war with any country, especially the United States or Japan, and the economy is reeling as a result of Taiwan operations, you could have massive social unrest and the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party by the Chinese people. So they're
Hmm.
not going to risk that, I believe, anytime in the near future. So what you could see instead, and I'll close on this, is the slow, attrited strangulation of Taiwan, diplomatically forcing countries around the world to cut off all ties, economically by forming its own semiconductor industry and not being dependent on Taiwan's any longer, and
Hmm.
also continuing to harass the Taiwanese military in the air, at sea, with the Chinese maritime militia of thousands and tens of thousands of fishing boats that harass Taiwanese boats and the Taiwanese economy, and essentially exhaust the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese government to decide to come to the table and negotiate the terms of their ultimate capitulation.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never heard of that angle of the small islands that are essentially Taiwanese islands and going in there first. I didn't realize that there were those. That would make perfect sense. Essentially, what Russia did, chipping away first with Crimea, and other regions, then
Hmm.
finally entering into Ukraine full scale. Of course, also consolidating Belarus and getting that under their auspices. In some ways, is China more, I don't know if the right word is vulnerable, but because of their incredible reliance on globalization, on world trade, because of their lack of essentially energy resources, they're very dependent, especially given their population. They don't have enough energy to supply their own country with. They have to,
Hmm.
one of the things they've been doing. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but they've been significantly increasing their relationship, the strength of the relationship with Iran. I believe one island in particular they've kind of taken over called Quiche. They've built a lot of infrastructure there, trying to get a foothold in Iran, because they're just such a energy dependent nation. On top of that, they're also a very vulnerable nation when it comes to food and food resources. Been that way throughout their entire history,
Hmm.
especially now with this fertilizer issue. That's the result of this Russia Ukraine uh, conflict, right? There's a lot of fertilizer that's going offline that people are speculating about, and how that can affect food resources around the world. Do you think that in some ways China could be more vulnerable because of their incredible amount of dependence on the entire world, and lacking adequate supplies in two of the most important areas, which is energy and food?
Ashton, the short answer is yes. So let's elaborate a little bit. You're absolutely correct. China is largely dependent on external sources for oil and for natural gas. It does have extensive ties to Russia already, and it will likely seek to exploit the cutoff of Russian energy resources of hydrocarbons to Europe. If Europe can accomplish that goal, which I'm highly skeptical of, my own sense is that Europe will remain highly dependent on Russian oil and natural gas for a long time to come. And these renewable
Hmm.
aspirations are more fantasies than real world policies. But we'll get to that later on.
Yep.
So China will look to buy whatever oil and natural gas Europe believes it won't need to purchase any longer, and they'll connect pipelines that are currently in place from central and northeastern Russia, connecting into China, and simply build pipelines across western Russia to connect those to Eastern Europe pipelines through Ukraine, through Poland, through Hungary to Europe. So they don't have to build 3 or 4 thousand mile long pipelines. They need to build several hundred pipelines, and it won't take
Hmm.
place tomorrow, but it can take place in a short order, 4 to 5 years, in Russia, and connect the current European natural gas and oil supply grid to that of China. We
Hmm.
also note that for about 3 months prior to China and Russia issuing their now famous February 4th or 5th joint statement at the opening day of the Beijing Olympics, declaring their relationship and their partnership having no limits. They will cooperate and build up that coordination on a series of policies across the full spectrum of diplomatic relations and trade relations. Again, going back to what we were saying earlier about taking world leaders at face value when they issue these types of statements. So I think they'll also be looking to increase their foodstuff imports from Russia. Interestingly, China is looking to ensure that their support for Russia does not disrupt their relationship with Ukraine, because
Hmm.
they're highly dependent on Ukraine for wheat, for other
Right.
major foodstuffs, as well as for critical metals and rare earths, which are very important for China's long term ambitions of essentially
Mm.
setting technological
Right.
standards for the remainder of the 21st century, the way the US and Japan did in the 20th century. And this is made again manifest
Hmm.
publicly in their Made in China 2025 strategy issued in 2015. And the other strategy, I think, issued in 2020 is called China Standards 2035, by which time they hope they will have created or consolidated international norms, platforms, and standards for technological based industries and sectors. They're very open about all of this. We just tend to ignore this in Washington, in Brussels, in most of the West. So China will be looking to increase its resilience, its independence from one or two source countries. And on energy, I will also add, Ashton, that
Hmm.
China resents the fact that international waters, upon which the trade that has made China so wealthy over the
Right.
last 20 years, remains patrolled and largely led by the United States Navy, along with our regional allies in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific
Hmm.
Ocean, in the Mediterranean, in the Persian Gulf region. And so China will look, I think, to move away from sea-based energy imports and put as much of this on pipelines on the Eurasian continent and on railways as possible.
I see. So that was actually that's perfect segue because that was my next question. As you mentioned, the United States
Hmm.
essentially controls international shipping lanes around the world. They control the global order of how things get moved around. And as we know, shipping something overseas is like 10 times cheaper, 20 times cheaper sometimes than shipping it over land. So
Hmm.
the way globalization is, the foundation of it is international shipping lanes that the United States is essentially in charge of. So the
Hmm.
question is, as the U.S. sort of turns more insular, we see a bit of this with respect to this current conflict again, Russia Ukraine, where we're not even at the negotiation table. We're not mediating it. It's Israel and France who are trying to play that role, or it's actually playing that role with regards to mediating the Russia Ukraine conflict. Famously, just a couple weeks ago, the UAE and Saudi crown prince didn't take President Biden's call back. And so there's that aspect. Part of that is sort of this administration that some of our allies don't trust, the Biden administration, but part of it is a trend of the United States sick of being the policeman in the world. I think the polls pretty much bear that out. Both parties have a sense that our interventionist strategies, we should tone that back, to say the least. So the question is, if the United States continues to go towards this more insularly focused trend, we're going to work on ourselves, right? Does that create way more turmoil for the world because there's a vacuum and we know vacuums invite chaos? And that seems like that would sort of screw over China, right? Because now there's this vacuum. Now China's going to have to what? They get a lot of their oil from the Middle East to this day. A lot of it has to come through that Malacca Strait, which is tiny. Um, and then Japan's going to have to secure their energy resources. So we have this sort of like vacuum if the United States doesn't play that role it's traditionally played for the last many decades. Do you see? First of all, do you agree with that? Do you agree that the United States is probably going to be more focused on itself and not as much on the rest of the world going forward, regardless of the candidate? Number one. Number two, does that create a vacuum that causes conflicts around the world? Where do you see those conflicts?
With your permission, let me answer number two first, and
Sure.
that'll give us the context for answering your first question. You're absolutely right, Ashton. Power abhors a vacuum, right? One of the most famous adages in human history. And if the United States is not leading the way in protecting international shipping lanes, then that void will be filled by others. And right now, for the foreseeable future, that void would be filled by China in the Indo-Pacific region. They really are the only other major country with the kind of naval power projection capability, and they would certainly seek to dominate the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Western Pacific, essentially everything between the Philippines and Hawaii, where the U.S. is now the predominant force. They would also probably look to project power into the Indian Ocean because that really is the maritime superhighway that
Hmm.
connects Chinese markets to both oil and natural gas supplies from the Middle East, but also through the Indian Ocean to the African continent for natural resources that China needs for many of its manufactured goods, and then through the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea to European markets to be able to put those finished goods to market. So the Indian Ocean is also a vital shipping lane for China, and you would probably see China and India contest for supremacy in that part of the
Hmm.
world. And then, of course, you would have countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, highly dependent on those shipping lanes, then looking to counterbalance to see how they're able to work with China and India so they're able to continue with their significant energy exports to Asian and to European markets. And in Europe, without the United States in place there, you would almost certainly have very difficult tensions between Russia on the one hand and Britain and France on the other, two nuclear powers in Europe, both with very powerful naval forces. And so you would have, if not chaos, you would have competition and constant rivalry around the Eurasian landmass and along the eastern coast of the African continent. That's what
Hmm.
one would first imagine a U.S. withdrawal would lead to. Which leads me to point number two. It's why I don't believe the U.S. will do so anytime soon. And there may be a greater desire on the part of the American people for the U.S. to pull back from many of its commitments. But let me offer a couple of my own thoughts here, Ashton, if I might. My own sense is that the American people are not war weary, even though we have been through 20 years of war in Iraq and in Afghanistan. But my own sense is reading the polls and talking to people as I travel around the country is they wonder why the United States doesn't win wars anymore. So
Hmm.
they'll support the U.S. military. It's our most trusted institution. And if
Right.
there is a compelling U.S. interest abroad, they'll support the president and the Congress if they dispatch forces to accomplish a goal, but to win. In other words, send our forces there and let them do the job that needs to be done and not engage in this kind of nation building and liberal humanitarian interventionism that many of us, and I'll include myself very honestly, thought maybe 20 years ago in the wake of the September 11th attacks was a necessary tool for foreign policy and diplomacy, especially in the broader Middle East and Northern Africa. And 20 years of essential failure has made very clear that liberal interventionism is also a failed policy. And that's why
Hmm.
we have to be careful with Ukraine. As heart wrenching as these images are of 10 million displaced Ukrainians, almost 4 million of them having become refugees spilling over into Europe, is the situation in Ukraine or between Ukraine and Russia a genuinely compelling U.S. strategic interest that is worth risking the potential exchange of nuclear weapons
Right.
between Moscow and New York, or Moscow and Washington, or major European capitals? So I think it's very important that we find a way to bring about, for instance, in this case, a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And
Hmm.
you mentioned before, Ashton, that there are a number of leaders who are hedging their bets. You're looking at the Saudi Arabia kingdom, you're looking at the United Arab Emirates, and you also note, say, the role of the Israelis in looking to
Right.
play an intermediary role in negotiations. I would add to the Israelis the role of French President Emmanuel Macron and Turkish
Hmm.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who are trying to keep doors open to both Russia and Ukraine, bring about a ceasefire, and bring an end to the war so that we can then figure out politically and diplomatically how we move this process forward. But to have this war continuing with no particular objective in sight, realistically speaking, at least to date, I haven't heard of a strategic interest coming from Washington or from Brussels, except to continue to arm the Ukrainians to beat back the Russians, which will come at tremendous cost to the Ukrainian people, to the Ukrainian economy, to Ukrainian society. And who's going to rebuild all of this? And how do we know we're going to do this without escalation to a chem bio attack, a major cyber attack
Right.
on a European or American infrastructure or energy grid, or God forbid, Vladimir Putin actually launches a tactical nuclear weapon against a military facility in Ukraine, or even worse, inside of a European country that's not in the NATO alliance?
Do you think that? Let me ask you a quick question about China. Then I want to get your prognostication about how the world sure shapes up, let's say by
Hmm.
2050, because, you know, from the World War II era on, it was pretty easy. It was America, it was Soviet Union, then it was just America, and now we have all these different players. Obviously, you reference a few of them. India on its rise up, should be a top three economy, right, within the coming decades. Maybe a number one or number two. Who knows how that goes? Japan is certainly, they have demographic issues, but they're certainly no joke. They have an incredible navy. They still have
Hmm.
technological development and play an integral role in the world economy. China's demographics are going off the cliff. It seems like they have the worst. I think they have the worst like demographics ever, right? Largely because of that one child policy. And and then obviously we have Russia sort of making this last hurrah, so to speak. Um, the European nations, they're kind of a thing of the past, but are they? Who knows? Germany seems, certainly that they are in a very vulnerable position, which is what happens when you don't, engage in nuclear energy anymore, right? They just gave up all their energy ambitions, and now they're completely reliant on Russia. Um, so first, let's talk about China. The How do you see the China? Let me preface it this way: the last from sort of early
Hmm.
2000s onward, particularly in the 2010s, the dominant narrative with China's going to take over. China's going to be number one. They're going to take over everything. I don't hear that much anymore from that narrative because there are certainly there seems to be a lot of issues with that China's dealing with, and particularly their demography issues. Another thing that was recently brought up was like they had to slaughter all these pigs, right? Because this like African flu, and like that's a huge that she feeds so many people, and so that gets back to the whole food vulnerability issue that they have. How do you see the China narrative playing out by 2050? Are they going to play as powerful a force or foe as the Soviet Union did, or have we seen their peak? Because we certainly seen their population peak, but have we seen their economic military peak, you think?
I try very hard, Ashton, to not look at this through absolute terms, but more through relative
Hmm.
terms. And by that, I mean all of the facts that you lay out about China and its demographic trends are accurate. But China can also engage in certain policies that can look to deflect the vulnerabilities that these demographic declines are leading towards. And they also have a one party state, and they're able to move with ruthless efficiency to accomplish whatever goals the government feels needs to be accomplished. And I say again in relative terms because I think much of this depends not only on what Beijing does, but also on what we do here in the United States. Its decline really is a choice. And if we choose to
Hmm.
decline relative to China, that's on the American people and our political and, frankly, our business and civic leadership. And my concern is that we have been so absurdly obsessed with sort of Russian meddling in American politics since 2015, 2016. The country that enjoyed all of that Russia distraction more than anyone else was China, because they were able to continue with a very
Right.
ambitious, very belligerent strategy in Asia and around the world. And our media are largely ignoring them. And it's to the
Hmm.
detriment of American long-term strategy. You're talking about 2050.
Yep.
I'm trying to stay as focused as I can on simply the next 5 years,
Mhm.
Ashton. So,
Yeah.
with your okay, I won't go to 2050 with any sort of
Okay.
long-term predictions, but look, for instance, at the fact that the Chinese government has instituted policies that generate 5 to 6 times more STEM engineers every year than
Yep.
does the United States. The 21st century economy on a global scale is going to be far more technologically based than anything we saw in the prior century. But if we're failing to get STEM engineers out of our graduate schools, and we have more and more
Hmm.
of our students taking on absurd amounts of student debt and learning liberal arts and social studies and failing to pay off their debt and buy a home and start a family and lead productive lives, I mean, frankly, we have our own very serious demographic, if not declines, disruptions or upheavals here in the United States in the next 5, 10, 20 years. And so I think we need to be very much focused on building up our technology infrastructure, and I mean that on a human scale, not just hardware and
Hmm.
roadways and transportation grids and the like. So I think that's going to be very important. We're going to have to beef up our military. That's a stark fact, and we have not wanted to do so. Uh, we are now at a point where the Biden budget for FY 2022 is the largest defense budget in history, nearly $800 billion. However, again, in relative terms, it is a decline because it is less than the rate of inflation affecting the rest of the fiscal year budget. So
Hmm.
almost every domestic program has increased anywhere from 10 to 15%, and the defense budget has actually shrunk in absolute terms after inflation. What we really need is $1 trillion defense budget. And that will get us the kind of Navy that can compete with China's Navy because they now have more ships than we do. They have more long range strike missiles that are able to destroy our aircraft carriers. And if we
Hmm.
lose aircraft carriers, we lose all power dominance in
Yep.
any of the regions of the world that we're patrolling the waters of. So we need to be able to develop our own long strike missiles to threaten the Chinese and basically put us in a position of mutual deterrence. We have failed to do so. We do not have adequate missile defense to deal with Russian and now Chinese hypersonic nuclear missiles. And
Yep.
North Korea is testing ICBMs at a pace they haven't in 6 years. So we're dealing with a much more dangerous world. And yet we continue to talk about culture wars and
Hmm. Hmm.
sort of social issues that distract us from the very, very dangerous and complex geopolitical landscape that we're facing. Certainly the most dangerous since the end of the Cold War and possibly going back to the end of World War II. So we need to build up our workforce, our education. We need to be serious about our defense, and we need Americans to love this country again.
Hmm.
The one thing that we do in the United States that almost no country in history has ever done is teach a generation of young people that its country is loathsome. Uh,
Yep.
People who detest their country or who are embarrassed of the founding of their country, however imperfect America is, and we're highly imperfect, but better than everyone else, from
Mhm.
my personal standpoint. But we won't want to defend America against our enemies if we're not proud of America.
Right.
So we need not only to get STEM engineers out to be able to compete on a technological level, but we need to better educate our young people that with all the imperfections, with all the flaws, we are all imperfect, sinning human beings. We have accomplished more in our 200 plus years as a country than any country in history. We have so much to be proud of, and we need to inculcate our young people of this, or else we're
Hmm.
doomed.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah, I mean, I joke about this, but I'm actually kind of serious too. That's why I have more respect for the Chinese Communist Party than some of the neo-Marxists we have over here teaching teaching our students in universities and in schools, right? I mean, at least the Chinese, they basically deputize their entire society to work on behalf of the Chinese government and project strength, right? And empower themselves. Whereas our postmodern neo-Marxists here essentially are have this nihilistic point of view that they try to destroy this country, destroy its history, destroy its foundation, create massive amounts of nihilism amongst the youngsters, the young people in schools, and yeah, I mean it's just sickening. And you're not going to be able to compete with a China when you got our people being taught how evil America is, and pursuing all these worthless degrees or fields of study that don't benefit them in any real sense and actually create even more bad ideas in their head. And then, as you said, China's pumping out 5 times more STEM graduates. With
Hmm.
the other thing about China, do you think that? Now, I'll ask you. I just want to ask you about India after this. But do you think that this experience we're having with this current conflict, Russia Ukraine, um, obviously what we saw with COVID, where so many of our major industries we didn't even know were based in China, like for example, the generic drug industry, right? A significant portion of it's based there. Taiwan, of course, has the semiconductor chips that basically fuel our entire
Hmm.
society. I think 50% of all our semiconductors are from Taiwan. Even the U.S. military is dependent on those chips, right? Which makes a Chinese takeover Taiwan that much more perilous for us. Do you think that this is going to incentivize or just further catalyze America to move the supply chains, move um, all these trade processes, the manufacturing to places like the U.S. or even at least Mexico, given this whole experience? I'll just finish with one quote by Larry Fink from BlackRock, who recently said this marks the end of globalization, speaking about the whole Russia Ukraine thing. Do you see that trend happening as well because of our now understanding of how vulnerable we are?
I would take a different approach than Mr. Fink, who I know is very highly regarded, right? He is the CEO of a multi-trillion dollar
Yeah.
investment firm at BlackRock. But I'm less concerned about quote unquote the end of globalization or deglobalization and looking more towards the future of how we re-globalize the global economy. We're never going to be completely self-dependent countries or markets or economies. It makes for bad economics. It makes for bad diplomacy. The question is, how do we realign our trade and commercial ties with countries so that when there are supply chains that are, for instance, outside the United States, we're not relying on hostile adversaries like China, but we're relying on allies or more reliable partners. Ideally, here in the Western Hemisphere, like you said, Ashton, like in
Hmm.
Mexico, Central America, Latin America, the Caribbean islands, friendly neighbors, and many of whom are in desperate need of economic revitalization. And it's very much in our interest because then it would stem the flow of illegal
Yep.
aliens into the United States because people would want to be able to thrive and prosper in their home countries,
Hmm.
not necessarily leave for an alien country, the United States. if they can have good economies, and actually you need also to deal with corruption and good governance in many of these countries, but you can start with proper economic reforms. But you certainly want to move your supply chains to the degree possible away from China. And that's going to be, I think, a major incentive. The problem that we have is that that's a political or policy objective, but many businesses still have a profound interest in working with Chinese partners because of the ruthless efficiency of the supply chain floors that the Chinese have been able to build over the last 20 years since we allowed them to join the World Trade Organization. So I think it's going to be a difficult process, but there's actually a fascinating debate, Ashton, I would say, taking place right here in Washington, where you have a convergence of the traditional left that has been pro-industrial policy, and now elements of a more sort of national conservatism element of the right that also supports some sense of an industrial
Hmm.
policy so that the government is helping to subsidize or at least incentivize those critical industries like medical and healthcare equipment, rare earths, energy, so that we're not dependent again on either dangerous parts of the world or governments in hostile countries. So I look to see how that debate plays out. I'm not convinced it's going to be something that we know the outcome of this year or next, but certainly over the next 3 to 5 years.
What do you see with respect to India's role in a world in which it's seeing like there's going to be a China sphere and a US influence sphere? How do you see India shaping things going forward?
India is a country with vast economic, military, and diplomatic power projection, depending on the decisions that the Indian government takes today and in the near term. And there are concerns that the government of Narendra Modi has continued to pursue a strongly nationalist Hindu line that alienates India's 200 million Muslims and that thwarts the kinds of economic liberalization that the relatively sclerotic Indian bureaucracy needs to actually allow the economy to flourish. But if you look at the demographic trends, Ashton, we spoke earlier about those in China and the United States. India's population will actually continue to grow potentially for the
Hmm.
next 20 to 30 years.
Hmm.
Projections are that by 2040, 1 out of every 5 workers in the world will be in India. So we're talking about a
Wow.
massive economy.
Wow.
Population will surpass China's in the next 10 to 12 years. But much of this also depends on the kinds of opportunities that the Indian government and the Indian business leadership will provide for their own people, including, as we all know around the world, very desperately needed social and legal reforms regarding caste society inside of India. You need to be able to allow people to realize their fullest potential in terms of social rise, in terms of education, in terms of competition within the Indian economy. So much of that depends on internal Indian decisions. Similarly, the degree to which India, as we see right now, is very carefully calibrating its position vis-a-vis the United States and its Quad partners in Australia and Japan, which have formed not an alliance, but basically a network of powerful Indo-Pacific countries to check China's very ambitious naval and overall military ambitions in the Western Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. But then we also have India's quite independent role vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine, where the US and European partners have been leaning on India to sanction Russia, to take punitive measures, to be stronger in its condemnation. And the Indian government saying, well, wait a second, we don't necessarily have a stake in this fight. We want to make sure that we continue to have access to Russian armaments. Remember that India and Russia have a history going back decades to the Soviet era, when India was the leader of the non-aligned movement and they purchased major weapon systems from the Soviet Union, and that continues to this day. So Russia is India's major arms supplier, and India feels threatened both by a nuclear-armed China in the Himalayas and a nuclear-armed Pakistan to its west. So India feels very much threatened, needs that Russian armaments relationship. It's also looking to expand its energy imports from Russia. And now that we see the potential for major food cutoff, especially wheat from Russia and Ukraine to the broader Middle East and Northern Africa, India has the potential to grow its wheat export industry by a factor of 300% over the next 5 to 6 years. So India has the potential to be an enormously more influential player in Asian politics, in the Indo-Pacific region, certainly in South Asia and its immediate sphere of influence. and on the world stage so that it could potentially surpass Japan and become the third largest economy in the world after the US and China. But this all depends on Indian government decisions, the will of the Indian people in the largest democracy in the world, and ultimately how India is able to effectively calibrate and counterbalance all of these security issues on the Asian continent.
What do you see as the potential global flashpoints that worry you the most?
This is always the grim part of a discussion, Ashton. And I don't mean to make light of very, very difficult geopolitical challenges. But, 6 months ago, we would have said Ukraine, and now we're inside the Ukraine cauldron. I don't know where we may see a flashpoint emanating from the region that we discussed earlier, Kaliningrad, where NATO is looking to bring Kaliningrad to the negotiating table with Russia in regards to its objectives in Ukraine. I'm very concerned about food shortages in countries such as Egypt and Lebanon, which are 80 to 100% dependent on Russia and Ukraine for their wheat supplies. And as I just mentioned, there are other countries such as India, perhaps the United States can supply some of that wheat, but it won't make up the 80% that a country like Egypt with 100 million people will need by the end of 2022. So their supplies and stock should last through the summer, but come fall or winter, you don't just put wheat on a ship and send it. There are long-term contracts to which current suppliers are obligated. You need to have the shipping or the trucking infrastructure to be able to deliver those goods, depending on the geography and the destination markets. And a country like Lebanon is already a tinderbox right now. It could be on the verge of a failed state. And anyone who has some sense of history recalls the turmoil that civil war in Lebanon brought to the entire Middle East from 1975 until the late 1980s. And we cannot afford to see a country as influential and as populous as Egypt have major food shortages lead to riots, as we saw in the Arab revolts of 2008, 2009, 2010. So that's another area of concern. I also am watching very closely for North Korea. I don't know where this spate of ICBM missile tests is becoming increasingly problematic, and a miscalculation by Kim Jong-un leads to some type of a response by South Korea or by Japan, for that matter, that then obligates the U.S. to intercede on behalf of our allies. And so we have that concern as well. And then, as we mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, or the middle of it, we don't know what China's ultimate ambitions are with Taiwan. And again, if it's not a massive island-wide invasion, an amphibious operation over all of Taiwan, what if we have a crisis involving one or two islands, as took place in the 1950s, the Quemoy Matsu crisis, which President Eisenhower then had to resolve by sending in aircraft carriers between China and Taiwan. And it was one of the first humiliating episodes for the Communist Party in Beijing at the hands of the United States that they are determined to never have repeated again. So we have a number of flashpoints all around the Eurasian Rim. And I'll close with this. Libya is still very much in a civil war. It was, looking back, a terrible mistake by NATO to overthrow the Gaddafi government in 2010, open up Libya now as a sieve not only for human trafficking from sub-Saharan Africa into Europe, but modern-day slavery. Men and women and children being sold in open slave markets in Libya today, 2022. An absolute international disgrace. And the degree to which food shortages affect other countries in Africa, you may have major migration flows into Europe in ways that will utterly overwhelm what took place in 2015.
That was an incredible conversation. John, thanks so much for being with me. Tell people where they can find more about you, learn more about your work, follow you.
My Twitter page is simply at John Sitilides. That's my Twitter handle. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Facebook. I have a YouTube channel with over 200 TV news and podcast interviews. And my website for direct communication is at Sitilides, SITILIDES.com.
John Sitilides, thanks so much, man. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Ashton.
If you enjoyed our show, please click subscribe to stay up to date with our YouTube channel and podcast, and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts so that we can keep delivering guys some great content. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week. We're going to talk about the issues that really matter. Our country, our economy, the Fed, QE, GDP, BTC, NFTs, AOC, the CCP, Cardi B, Yeezy, Yellow Socks, Iran, Joe Biden's dementia, come on, man, and probably sex robots. We stand for a free and open debate and exchange of ideas. And if you disagree with anything we talk about, you are a racist and no better than Hitler. What? Let's get started.